no quest ever comes to a final step. Welcome to the Abyss Garden. It's been a while. In July of this year, my partner went on a long-expected trip to Japan, and I used these 3 weeks she was away to craft a special birthday present for her. I always try to create some thoughtful and entertaining gifts for this silly lady I love. But since we live together, it's been somewhat tricky to do it without her knowledge. Though given the time I had on hand this year, I thought I could finally get into a really complex project. So I pondered for a while, and ended up settling on creating a game. It's not the first one I made for her. 2 years ago I created A Sea of Boxes, a roguelite card game in which you help random fluffs travel as far as they can, using treats and artifacts found in the mysterious remains of ancient lands. It was a really fun experience, and I learned a lot, mainly from the countless mistakes and ways I could have done it better. I'm probably gonna go back to it at some point and make it a full-fledged game, but in the meantime, given this experience, I felt more confident to try and create a new card game for this year's birthday, and so I went on drafting some early ideas. For background, my partner and I started playing Magic the Gathering a few years back, and we designed plenty of decks, battling each other and trying to reach a 50-50 win rate between us. But we've never been huge fans of the inherent violence that Magic's gameplay provide, the idea of creatures fighting to death against each other. So I knew that if I were to emulate some of the mechanics we enjoyed in MTG, the whole fighting part had to go. As another piece of information, my partner is a psychology and pedagogy teacher, and we both share a deep interest for the theories that emerge from this field. So there I was. I set on creating a card game without violence, using our doodles, and based on psychological theories. But before starting head-on, like I did with A Sea of Boxes, I took some time to research. First, I wanted to see what other card game creators made, and how they went on doing it. I did read some articles, watched a few GDC talks from experienced game designers, and ended up discovering this rabbit hole of homemade TCG creators. The most well-known ones, Chaos Galaxy and Shard TCG, were really helpful to understand the common pitfalls that one might be blinded to when creating the early drafts of a new card game. And so, from these creators, I also discovered TheGameCrafter, a printing company which specializes in indie board games. This company would allow me to get professional cards printed, but way more importantly, they provide a lot of features, including the ability to create boosters with randomized cards based on their rarity, the option to set a maximum number of duplicates, and the possibility to create deck boxes and other bundles. So by now, I knew that the game I wanted to create could have unique randomized cards, and that I was able to have professionally printed boxes and boosters. It might not sound like much, but given my experience with A Sea of Boxes, it provided a lot more freedom. I wouldn't have to redraw each individual card, build boxes on my own, and I could iterate way faster. On the other hand, TheGameCrafter prints their cards in huge sheets that are then cut into 18 pieces. What that meant for me is that I now had a golden number, 18. A number that I could use to design the size of decks and boosters, something which will have a huge influence on the gameplay itself. Let's do some simple math. With a base number of cards per booster of 18, the size of decks I could go for that would make the most sense would be 18 itself, 36, 54, 72 and so on. Basically all the multipliers of this golden number. Now let's have a look at Magic. The decks we created with my partner are made up of 60 cards, and on average, 24 of them are lands, which is the main resource of this game. For those of you who have played trading card games, you know that Magic is basically the grandfather of them all, and that lands as resources has turned out to be kind of an issue. It's a feature that tends to complicate gameplay a lot, and often adds way too much randomness, and leads to frustrating moments. So I knew that I wouldn't use any similar resource, and thus, if we use magic as an example of what to go for, while excluding the lands, simple math tells us that 60 minus 24 is 36, exactly twice our golden number. So I was now settled on the size of the decks. The next question was the number of duplicates. In any TCG, one is only allowed to have a certain number of similar cards in their deck. This is a feature that has a huge impact on gameplay. Basically, the more similar cards you're allowing in a deck, and the more stable your deck becomes. For example, if your deck had to be made of totally different cards with no duplicate, you would have a really low chance of drawing the card you might need at any given time. On the other extreme, if your deck is made entirely of one card, duplicated again and again, you will always know that you're gonna draw it next. So my choice here was to decide on how random or stable I wanted this game to be. Using once again the example of Magic the Gathering, I knew that I wanted this new game to be more stable and strategic, rather than leaning on more randomness. Magic allows you to put a maximum of 4 copies of any one card in your deck, which makes it at most a 4 out of 60 chance to draw this card, or roughly 6%. And so what I set on for this new game was to also allow 4 copies of any one card. But given that our decks are 36 cards, it leaves us with at most a 4 out of 36 chance to draw this card, or roughly 10%. The real math is a bit more complicated, but the overall idea stays the same. There are some other underlying reasons behind the choices I mention here, as I try not to get too much into details. But one that is important to mention is that I am one person, and will never be able to create as many cards as a full-fledged team of designers. Thus, having small decks of 36 cards with the ability to have 4 duplicates leads to way less individual cards to create, before reaching the critical number needed for a fully playable game. With these choices, I was able to get away by creating sets of 80 unique cards, while other TCGs require sets that are 2 to 3 times larger to be able to reach similar results. Alright, so by this time I had the basics. I knew that I was going to build a game played with 36 card decks, with up to 4 duplicates, and I calculated that I would need to create roughly 80 unique cards for it to be playable. It was now time to head into the theme. As mentioned before, I already knew that I wanted this game to be centered around our shared interest of psychology. But at that moment, I didn't have a clear idea yet. It was still a bit of a nebulous concept. So since my partner wasn't home, I sneakily scoured through some of her textbooks. Though they're in German, and I'm still far from a fluent speaker, all the diagrams and illustrations still spoke to me, each of them a simplistic explanation of a complex topic. I selected a few, found some online articles I could read through, and simply immersed myself, hoping for some bright idea to pop in my head. But nothing like that happened. Though every theory was super interesting in its own right, they didn't have enough in common to be able to merge them together into a coherent whole. And that's pretty much when it clicked for me. There was no point of trying to reduce the entire field of psychology into one clunky game. The path forward was to choose one single theory and to run with it. And so after debating with myself for a while, I ended up selecting the one that seemed to connect with most others. And it just happens to be the one that was probably the easiest to gamify. This theory is the emotion classification of Robert Plutchik. 10 postulates most well known for the illustration they inspired, Plutchik's wheel. I won't bore you by reading these 10 postulates, you can easily find them. But they ended up being a template for understanding the evolution of species and the emergence of emotions in the brain. As far as turning this theory into a game, there was plenty of material. Plutchik's classification provides us with 8 emotions, each with 3 levels of intensity, and each with their respective relationship to one another. Thus, after some drafting time, it turned into 8 family of cards, each based on one emotion, what you might call factions in other games. Each of these families were then divided in 3 types, from their lowest to highest intensity, what you might call power level or rarity in other games. And finally, all these relationships provided plenty of gameplay ideas for each of the cards. But maybe the most important thing here is that basing the core of this game on Plutchik's wheel left the door open for any other psychological theory to get integrated in the future, as they pretty much all have a connection to emotions. And so now I had the math, parts of the style of game I wanted, and a strong theme to build upon. Next on the to-do list was gameplay. So, I'm a bit of a silly person. Remember that I told you about these gifts I made for my partner? Well, I got into crochet a while back and really enjoyed to make her some tiny amigurumis, whether it be creatures, plants, some Ghibli characters and so on. And it just happens that the year prior, I added a mysterious gift among these silly creatures. A 3x4 playmat with 12 chambers. I'm a big fan of foreshadowing, and so even though at that time I didn't know the purpose of this playmat, I knew that at some point I would make something for it. And there we are. I have a board of 12 chambers and a skeleton of a card game based on psychological theories. It seems obvious now, but at the time I still struggled a bit, going back and forth between different ideas, before finally settling on the last one. This playmat would represent an empty mind, and each card would be a thought that the player adds to it. Like the brain of a child, slowly experiencing life. Each thought would bring a unique emotion to its mind, influencing the rest of them. No violence, no fighting, but a deeply tactical game in which players share their thoughts. And that's also when I came up with the final name of the game, Mind Worlds. Now, before creating the cards themselves, the only thing left to do was to design the high-level gameplay, to define how to win, when to play the turn step, and so on. So there are a lot of iterations I went through, and plenty of converging reasons for the different choices I made, for the different parts of the gameplay. But there was 3 main pillars I went back to again and again. The first one was that I wanted reasonably short games that would hover around 20 minutes. And the easiest way to tweak this was to implement a turn limit. Instead of fighting the other player until their life point goes to 0, this game offers you 12 turns to play your cards, at the end of which, the player with the most influence wins. The second pillar was that I wanted players to be always alert. The way to achieve this was to create a train of thoughts, a gameplay system that allows players to answer each other's cards, and ultimately to mess up with each other's plans. Similar to the instant speed in Magic, this system provides you with opportunities to react. It avoids the risk of players simply following a plan for the entire game. Players have to anticipate and change their plan every turn, making hard decisions with limited information. And finally, the third pillar was my will to have a gameplay with lots of highs and lows. This pillar was a bit harder to implement, until I started to pay closer attention to the resource system. What I ended up with is a 2-way system. The first is time counters. Players receive one of those every turn and can spend them to play cards. But the second is discarding. Players may discard one of their cards in order to play another. This leaves players with plenty of options, allowing them to play a lot of cards in critical moments, or to save their resources and try to gain small advantages here and there. And with this, all that was finally left to do was to create the cards themselves. I won't go through each card and the reasoning behind them, but if you're interested, they're all available in our website, mind-worlds.ch. What I will touch on here is the three elements that make up these cards. The first is requirements. We established that some cards were based on different intensity of emotions. The most intense the card, the most powerful its effect is. Inspired by Plutchik theory, I designed a system which requires the mind to have reached a certain state in order to play specific cards. For example, you're unlikely to experience ecstasy before having first experienced joy and serenity. And thus to play an ecstasy card, there must be at least 4 of these others in the mind. These kind of requirements vary with each emotion, depending on their relationships, while ecstasy and grief mostly care about themselves. Admiration and terror care about neighboring emotions. This all leads to specific card combinations being way more synergistic than others, and thus leads to a more interesting deck building experience. The second element on the cards is their effect. Based on the emotion they embody, these effects range from forgetting other thoughts to copying them. The main challenge here was to make sure to have every card be unique, and for each of them to reflect their color identity. I went deeper into Plutchik theory and identified the core elements that made each emotion distinct. This is something that might be easily overlooked, but crafting unique mechanics that reflect each card's personality is what allows you to bridge the gap between the gameplay and the underlying story of the game. And finally, the third element on the cards is their gain. It is the amount of influence that each card offers you as they enter the mind. This amount varies depending on each emotion, and on the state of the mind as they enter. Weak emotions entering an empty mind will bring very little influence, while intense emotions entering a mind filled with their peers will provide great rewards. Influence is the one and only win condition for this game, and it's here that I had to make sure that each card feels balanced, that the game provided by every thought reflects how the emotions might impact one's mind. And there we are. I ended up creating these cards one by one until the first set of mind worlds came to life. Once my partner was back from Japan, I finished the last touches, set up boosters and decks on TheGameCrafter, and waited patiently for them to ship and for my partner's birthday to arrive. And there we were at the last step, which was basically playing. We ended up refining the rules, beta testing the cards, the decks, and well, talking about future sets to come, and the different theories that they could be based on. It's been a bit of a wild ride, but Mind Worlds is now more stable than ever, and every potential new set fills me with excitement, especially now that we are both in it together. In case anyone would like to share this adventure, we decided to officially launch the first set of Mind Worlds this last November, 2 months after my partner's birthday, and we are now looking forward to any feedback we will get. We created 3 bundles for the occasion, among all the boosters and decks already available, and we have begun a tiny tournament to help explain the rules to anybody interested. This should be one of the next videos that pops up on this channel. I hope you had fun following this tiny adventure. And, oh yeah, I almost forgot. We also made a tiny trailer.